Hello, this is Paul Saunders. Welcome to another episode of the Three Questions podcast. I'm excited today to have one of my former Center for the National Interest colleagues, Dr. Nikolas Gvosdev. And Nick is a professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College in lovely Newport, Rhode Island, which, since we're talking right at the beginning of May, I think will be getting lovelier and lovelier over the course of the next few months until it becomes possibly somewhat less lovely for a period of time. But I will leave it to Nick to judge that. So he's a professor at the Naval War College. He's a non-resident fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, where he edits the journal, or I guess it's online also too now,
Online as well.
Orbis, that FPRI produces, which is sort of a publication a little bit analogous to our own national interest at the Center for the National Interest. And Nick was also a former editor of the National Interest. So kind of a special pleasure to be talking today. And I thought this was kind of a good opportunity today to take a little bit of a step back and, certainly to talk about some of the current events that we've got in the world right now. And I think for many of us, the U.S. and Israeli war in Iran is a big preoccupation, really, among things that are happening in the world today. But to talk a little bit about that, and then to sort of step back and maybe think about how that, might connect to some other things. So, Nick, thank you so much for being with
Thank,
me. Really
thank
great to
you.
have you here.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Just diving right in here, we're talking on May 1st. The episode will go online in a few days on the 4th, I expect. But we're like a couple of months into the war on Iran. We've got kind of energy prices ticking slowly upward. We have a situation really kind of not unlike most conflicts that become long conflicts, in which the two sides sort of each feel that time is on their side and they can wait, and costs for the other side will just grow and grow and grow until they're forced to capitulate. Energy has been very much at the center of this because of Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, and then the Trump administration imposing its own blockade outside the strait to try to prevent the Iranians from closing everybody's traffic except their own. And certainly, at least as of today, we'll see what the situation is by Monday. But, as we're talking today, it looks like the administration might be getting ready to take some additional military steps. We'll find out, I guess, soon enough. There's been this long negotiating effort that sort of predated the war. I mean, that's kind of why we got into the war in the first place. It doesn't really seem to be working. The negotiations. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, who do you think is going to blink first? Is it going to be Washington? Is it going to be Tehran? And why do you feel that way?
Well, first, let me just say that these are my own personal opinions and assessments, and based on what I read in the news, like everyone else. And my sense of this is that right now, neither side wants to blink. Neither side is prepared to blink. And the question then becomes not whether one side or another blinks, but whether or not circumstances preclude one side or another from continuing down their course of action. And so, what do I mean by this? So, for the United States has laid out certain conditions. The president, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, the Secretary of State have all essentially laid out a series of conditions which at present are unacceptable to the Islamic Republic. The question will be, at what point does moving on those conditions or adhering to them raise costs for the United States in a way that the United States is prepared to back away or modify or accept a partial settlement, which doesn't necessarily address everything, but gives the United States some ability to say, we got what we wanted. And I don't think we're there yet, in part because I think the prevailing mood in Washington, if I'm understanding it correctly, is that while the closure of the strait has created difficulties, that alternates are in place. There's a lot of confidence about, for example, oil, that oil is being diverted by Saudi Arabia to its port on the Red Sea, that the UAE can divert some of its production directly to the Indian Ocean, to the ports on the Indian Ocean, that other suppliers are able to meet some of the gap. Alternate sources of supply are there, so that while prices are higher, there isn't necessarily a sense that the shock is catastrophic. Now, some of the business analysts are warning that the shock is coming later down the pike, and so that that assessment may change. But that the feeling is that you have not reached a tipping point of domestic or international pressure on the United States right now at the beginning of May that forces an end to this. So the United States is not in a position, is not willing to blink. Iran, particularly the Islamic Republic, views this now as an existential crisis, so that this is different from the 12-day war of last year, where Iran understood, or the leadership at least was operating under a sense that there were gains and losses, but that essentially the end of the 12-day conflict didn't presage a major upset in how Iran is governed or the balance of power in the region. And I think Iran's view is that as long as these interruptions continue, as long as uh, we are not returned to sort of a normal situation in the Persian Gulf, that the pressure will build on the United States, and that Iran just needs to hold on. It needs to hang on until such point into the summer or the fall where they expect conditions will be so negative that there'll be this outcry for resolving this conflict on terms which are more acceptable to Iran than what is currently on offer. For both sides, if neither side is really willing to blink, which is where I think we're at, the question is I may not want to blink, but outside circumstances beyond my control may force my hand. And I think that the two tests here are in the United States, the ongoing economic pressure, if that accelerates faster, if the American public is less willing to accept the logic of higher gas prices to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon as we get closer to the midterm elections, does all of this produce pressure on the administration to uh, make some sort of settlement? For Iran, the test for the government is if it continues to experience military strikes, at what point does that compromise its ability to retain control over the country? And that even if it doesn't want to blink, it will either have all of its capabilities so degraded that it doesn't matter whether they want to blink or not. They will, in essence, either be forced from power or be forced to accept some sort of settlement that right now they're not willing to do so. But I think you're opening a description of this is apt, that right now we're in a situation where both sides feel time is on their side, and that they have to outweight and outlast the other. And given that, unless there's some fundamental change in either the military balance or something happens politically, either in Iran or in the United States, we may be entering into a new normal. And let me just add this, that something that I think we do need to think about is a classic situation of no war and no peace, right? So a lot of this is phrased as that there's a binary. The strait is open, the strait is closed. There is peace, there is war. What happens if we're evolving into a situation where there is no war, but it's not quite peace? As we've seen, these blockades, these and counter blockades are leaky. Things are still passing through, obviously in much smaller quantities, but it's not a total blockade in either form. Could we be in a situation where things are open, they close again, and we evolve into this no war, no peace dilemma? And that actually has the possibility of something that could then go on for a much longer period of time.
Sort of like what we might call a frozen conflict in other contexts. I mean, it kind of strikes me that what you're describing for Iran, the task that the Iranian leaders face is kind of very similar to the task that the weaker side, in most conflicts generally faces, which is demanding, but it's not always as demanding as what the stronger side has to do, in the sense that the Iranians kind of have to not lose.
Yeah.
And as long as they sort of avoid losing and just spin this out, then it's kind of the burden is on Washington, to win, because we're the ones who sort of want, at least as the Iranians see it, to have the strait reopened, and obviously the administration is kind of banking on the Iranians also needing the strait open. But this is sort of a good pivot a little bit, maybe, since we're talking about conflicts where, one party is sort of, significantly more capable than the other party, and yet the weaker party has managed to endure for quite a while. That kind of makes us think about Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, we had just in the last several days here, I think a Trump Putin phone conversation. And it sounds like they, from the accounts that have come out from the two sides, there was some discussion of Iran. There was also some discussion of the war in Ukraine. There was not clear evidence of any particular progress in either case. So you've got a situation now where, we've got the United States and Russia, who are hard not to think about as adversaries at this point, and one might be able to come up with the even stronger vocabulary than that. Certainly, there would be some who would want to do that, and we're adversaries, and we're both involved on opposite sides in these two conflicts. If the Iran war kind of drags on in the way that you're sort of suggesting that it could, because actually, much like the Ukraine war, both sides think that time is on their side, and they're just trying to stretch out the clock, and they think that just stretching out the war is sort of a sufficient strategy almost unto itself to prevail. How do you think these two conflicts link and interact over time? What sort of implications does that have for the United States?
I mean, I think the first starting point is to understand, as we've seen over the last 20 years, that Russia and Iran, both as major suppliers of energy to the global economy, we're in a position where you can really pressure one or the other, but it's hard to pressure both simultaneously. We saw this in the run up to the JICPOA, the nuclear deal in 2015, that in order to maximize pressure on Iran, the United States and other countries were prepared to somewhat turn a blind eye to Russia, or to expect that Russian energy supplies would help make up for some of the differences if we were asking parties to sanction Iran. After 2022 and the resumption of full scale military operations on Russia's part in Ukraine, we were interested, we and our allies, in putting a lot more pressure on Russia, including finding ways to limit Russia's ability to export its energy in order to gain revenue and influence. Now that we have this crisis in the Gulf, and not only Iranian energy, but energy from all the Gulf states, from Iraq, from Kuwait, from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, are impacted by it. The question then becomes uh, whether or not we retain the pressure on Russia. And as we've seen over the last several months, the United States has been prepared or willing to relax some of its sanctions pressure on Russia in order to ensure that global energy markets were not completely destabilized by the crisis in the Gulf. So that is one area of interrelationship where we are all trying to navigate this balance. The second, of course, is that we have these um, entente relationships. I don't like to call them alliances because alliance has a much stronger sense. But Russia and Iran have a strategic partnership. That strategic partnership was very important for Russia in the early days of adapting new ways of fighting, particularly drone technology. Ukraine, of course, is not a formal ally of either the United States or of the Europeans, but is a strategic partner, an entente partner, so we could speak. And so, after the full scale invasion resumed, we saw a lot more direct military aid, intelligence support to Ukraine. The question now becomes, are these two conflicts now linked together? And what I see is, on the one hand, there is a move among some to say a defeat of Iran in the Persian Gulf contributes to a Russian defeat in Ukraine, or vice versa, that by defeating Russia in Ukraine right now, or accelerating the efforts to aid Ukraine now, weakens the ability of Iran to resist. So, on the one hand, we have a policy perspective that says we should essentially now merge these two conflicts and really see them as the same conflict. This is harkens back to the discussion of whether or not we're in a world war that we had at the Center for the National Interest a month ago with Paul Post. And that thinking of, is this really just one conflict with the United States on one side, with Iran on the other? Certainly, the Russian assistance to Iran is something of concern to the U.S., but the Russian response is this is no different than the assistance the United States provides to Ukraine. The question also for the administration has been whether or not Russia can be helpful, and this gets back to your first question about the blinking and the negotiations. If you think that Iran is not likely to give up its nuclear material willy nilly, is there a proposal by which Russia takes custody of that material that is sort of face saving for Iran, that achieves a U.S. goal of getting that material outside of Iran so that the U.S. can claim success in this operation and sort of bolsters Russia's position, does that something that is potentially in the cards? The Iranians may not be interested. Russia may be interested, but would want to see what the Trump administration could then deliver vis-a-vis Ukraine. That is, would the Trump administration be willing to put significant pressure on Ukraine, as well as upon its European allies, to accept a settlement in Ukraine that would fall short of uh, the stated preferences of the West, which is that Russia must return to certainly to the pre-2022 lines, and if not, and ideally back to the pre-2014 borders, which I think at this point Russia is not inclined to do. This question about interaction, I think, is also important, just from, again, my observation of the call, less about what it says for the Putin-Trump interaction, but how what appears to be the two policy communities really pouring cold water. That my sense from the Russian side, at least for what I've been reading in Russian social media, is a sense that this is not something that is beneficial, that the Trump administration really is not able to deliver any sort of compromise on Ukraine that fits Russian interests. And certainly the president has received a lot of criticism, not only from Democrats, but from other Republicans about his engagement with Putin, particularly at a time when uh, Russian capabilities, or at least ostensibly, are being argued as being one of the reasons that Iran has been able to hold out against the United States longer than perhaps we would have expected. So your question really hits to this final point, which is how does the interaction between these two conflicts play out? And this is something where there really needs to be some hard thinking because left to its own devices, two separate conflicts could in fact become part of a single overarching conflict, which may not in fact be in U.S. interests to see happen. Uh, the other question is from the Russian side is whether or not prolongation of the conflict in the Persian Gulf in fact benefits Russia because the longer that goes on, it does distract the United States away from support for Ukraine, from being able to sustain the level, particularly of rearmament, as more armaments are being used in Iran. It's less that's available for delivery to Ukraine, and so. Does Russia benefit? So the argument from the Russian side is: does Russia benefit from helping the Trump administration achieve some of its goals in Iran, or does it in fact benefit from having this conflict go on, for having it be a frozen conflict, for having it continue to draw U.S. attention and resources? And if it's the latter, then that means that this will continue to be a friction point rather than a point where Moscow and Washington might find some common ground.
For the third of the three questions, let's kind of take yet another sort of step back from the war underway in Iran. For those of us in the Washington D.C. policy community, it kind of sometimes feels like it's impossible to discuss any particular issue without at some point in the conversation somebody trying to connect it to China in some way, right? So what does this have to do, with the U.S. Strategic competition or rivalry or whatever one wants to call it with China? There's been a very big discussion since the Russian invasion of Ukraine about the implications of that for China, and there's this whole discussion of Russia has to be defeated because if they're not, China will invade Taiwan. There's sort of a different kind of discussion related to the Iran war and the implications of that for China. And, a lot of it kind of has to do with, China's dependence on imported oil from the Persian Gulf, which is significant and certainly greater than that of the United States by far at this point. But on the other hand, kind of substantially below that of some of our close friends and allies. Where do you come out on kind of the implications of all of this for China? Is this like a big opportunity to impose some kind of huge strategic defeat on China by the United States like controlling and choking off, their energy from Iran, or the other view, if I can put it in the crassest possible form, is sort of Chinese leaders sitting in their offices in Beijing, rubbing their hands in glee at the United States, being bogged down in another war in the Middle East. How do you think this kind of matters and plays out for China and especially for this competition?
Right. Well, it's a great question. Let me preface it by just making this note. Russia's attack on Ukraine, the U.S. intervention in the Gulf vis-a-vis Iran, we're now 2 for 2 in conflicts where a major power has found that a middle power, even though technically it is weaker than the larger power, is able to resist and frustrate the strategic aims of the larger power. So, if the Russians thought that Ukraine could be brought under management after a lightning quick campaign, if the United States thought that a lightning strike on Iran would lead to major shifts, and both of us, our strategic establishments, are digesting the lessons of middle powers, having capabilities to frustrate the plans of great powers. And so is there a comparable lesson being learned now in China vis-a-vis Taiwan to say Russia and Ukraine, the U.S. and Iran, this doesn't actually point well to the idea that the PRC could forcibly subjugate Taiwan easily and quickly. So is we don't know yet. We don't know how those lessons are being digested, but I would suggest that there might be some thinking in Beijing that says we need to we need to think about whether or not all the planning we've been doing can be frustrated by the capabilities that Taiwan has to bear. And therefore, do you shift to means other than war, kinetic war, in order to achieve your goals vis-a-vis Taiwan? With regard to, China sitting back, looking at things, I think it's important, again, to realize Chinese strategic planners have been thinking about the risks that China would have for an interruption of energy from the Gulf for the last 2 decades. Now, their planning was predicated on the notion of the United States blocking the Straits of Malacca and blocking energy transit. This is perhaps the precipitating cause is different, but the result is still something that China has been preparing for years. This has driven, of course, China's strategies at various points to really expand the size of its strategic energy reserves, to develop redundant capabilities, even when purely market forces might say building additional pipeline capacity from Central Asia or from Russia doesn't necessarily make market sense, but from a strategic sense, this was, of course, guiding China's push into electrification and moving towards can we develop more electric vehicles and alternative power sources. So in a way, China has been preparing for this eventuality, and I think that they are in much better position than perhaps is appreciated in Washington to weather this conflict. What I think where this conflict is giving China potential opportunity, and how Xi Jinping, President Xi, and his staff and his government handle this will be a real test. But two real opportunities have emerged. The first is that once again treaty allies in East Asia have discovered that when there is a problem or a crisis, they're not at the top of the list. And the symbolism of the United States pulling out its terminal high altitude air defense system, the THAAD system from South Korea, to bring it to the Middle East, a system that South Korea accepted at great political and economic cost over Chinese protests less than a decade ago, and having uh, paid that price to see it just be yanked out and moved, sends a signal that I think China may very well exploit, which is treaty allies, partners of the U.S., you may not be at the top of the list when it comes to U.S. priorities. And does that give China the opportunity to get other countries to question the value of their relations with the United States? The second is the energy disruptions that are occurring are hitting U.S. partners in Asia at a much greater level. And those partners, but particularly Korea and Japan, have also more or less been supporting the US led sanctions regimes on Russia. They may try to weaken that a bit now, but the ability of China with its economic relationship with Russia to continue to purchase Russian energy. Now, of course, the Russians are in a little bit better position to charge or to claw back some of their discounts that they had to offer. But does China become a reseller of Russian energy in the same way India is a reseller of Russian energy to other states in Asia, and for China to say the U.S. created an energy crisis for you, China can help you solve your energy crisis, or at least get you through the energy crisis? And is this a way again of weakening the U.S. position in the region? frankly, Paul, we've been around long enough to raise families in the timeline in which we were told that the U.S. was going to make a definitive pivot to Asia. And we're still talking about a pivot to Asia in 2026 that appears to still be a pivot that's great to put into a strategic document, but when push comes to shove, the pivot pivots back. And I think that if China can learn, which the Chinese establishment has had difficulty with in the past, if it can tap down some of its things that make its neighbors uneasy and can emphasize these points about U.S. as an unreliable security provider. China can help you either with hydrocarbons or with alternate energy technologies to help you get through the energy shock. It may lead to a rebalancing of ties where countries rebalance their relationship with Beijing and Washington in a way that may not be amenable to U.S. interests. And so here, China obviously is suffering a short-term shock as well. But like Russia, China may not be that displeased to have the U.S. be much more pulled back into the Middle East. And especially going back to my first answer, if we start to evolve into this no war, no peace, open, closed, some energy comes out, some energy doesn't, that may be a situation which China can learn to live with if it means that it will be distracting the United States. And so there is a concern here that from the U.S. side that the emphasis on sort of how much emphasis we put on this conflict now has to be weighed against what are the strategic trade-offs. And here, the effort again to try to link, well, the war in against Iran has implications for China. I think it doesn't have implications in the way that some people say, well, if the Islamic Republic is overthrown, then that will also deter China, just as I'm not a proponent of the belief that a defeat for Russia in Ukraine changes China's strategic calculus as well. I think we have to be very careful about how this plays out. And of course, we'll see with what happens with the upcoming summit between Presidents Trump and Xi in terms of the confidence that China exhibits at that summit and the extent to which the president travels and is seen as weakened by his hand is weakened by what's going on in the Middle East.
Thanks very much, Nick, for that. There are kind of so many other things we could talk about and directions we could go in off of that toward the tail end there. You were kind of making me think that it would be kind of a great irony of this situation if we found, for example, that a kind of a long-term disruption in the oil market would, on one hand, help China to sell millions and millions more electric vehicles all over the
Yeah,
planet, along with, by the way, the coal-fired power plants
yeah,
to to recharge the batteries. So, but because if you're having trouble, if anybody's having trouble getting oil or LNG, for their grid, where do you go? But in any event, too many other things to talk about that we regrettably can't pursue today. But thank you so much for coming on the Three Questions podcast. Again, for the listeners, this is Dr. Nikolas Gvosdev, who's a professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. So, Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.